I'm really excited about Isabel Wilkerson's book, the Pulitzer Prize winner. Her book is called The Warmth of Other Suns, and it talks about a typical American migration story, one that is even common to my own family. What is striking about it, however, is the extent to which the dominant culture seemed very unaware of this normal migration pattern that affected all Americans, actually. And the book talks about how, and I'll mention some of the ways, but um, that how the dominant culture was just extremely unaware of this migration pattern, but interestingly, also very unaware of the ramifications or even the reality of Jim and Jane Crow, of the American apartheid system. And so, even on my videos, you have all these people talking about black people are whining and crying, and it strikes me that people can say that because they just don't have any idea. And I often wonder, how is it that people have no idea that masses of black Americans moved north, certainly after the turn of the century and during Reconstruction to some extent, but more so after World War II, such that, as the author said in a recent interview, and I haven't read the book, but I've heard so many interviews about it, I'm excited about it, and that's what this video is about, is my own excitement, and to motivate you to go read it, is that for example, every first black mayor in America, their parents came from the cotton fields. Some of them, she even mentioned, I can't remember who, actually picked cotton himself. There were instances of people who were not able to leave the South because the rules of Jim Crow meant that they wouldn't let them. But what was more interesting is that she talks about, in this interview, she mentions it, and I'm sure she talks about it more in her book, was that all of the implicit rules that you had to learn in order to survive as a black person in the Jim and Jane Crow South. I mean, she gave the example of where, if you were a black motorist, you couldn't pass a white person in front of you no matter how slow they were going. And so if ultimately you have black people who are cowering away from any sort of social interaction with white people, and because there are so many implicit rules, you don't know what rule you could break, and it could end up being your life. Like, I only need to give the example of Emmett Till, who was a teenager coming from the north down to the south in the summer, just like many people had done, because we all have family in the south. And he winked at a white woman, and he lost his life for it brutally. He was maimed, beaten, tortured. He wasn't decapitated, but he was, I believe, the typical thing that they do is cut off your genitals. And I think that we can all try and unpack why the genitals are such a source of scourge in America, why the black genitals are often very on display. And we know that the things that are on display are both loved and hated, make us feel inferior and used to punish and try and make us feel superior. So this book, I look at my own grandmother, I say, who came from Alabama, Jim and Jane Crow, Alabama, and when I was sitting with her on the past election night where Barack Obama won, my mother was telling me that they moved back south, obviously, the migration back south that we're talking about, from my grandparents' generation, that the book talks about the move north. My grandmother voted in the state capitol for Barack Obama. When my grandmother left during the period of the Great Migration, she was not able to enter the building, let alone vote for a quote-unquote black president. Think of that. And, it's just these very slight sort of stories that, we've all heard of migration stories. It's a part of the African-American narrative, such that, you meet somebody in Louisville, Kentucky, a black person in Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm from, that's why I give the example, and none of these people are from Louisville. Most of us, Harold Washington, the Honorable Brother Harold Washington, who's from Kentucky, and his family migrated north to Chicago. But everybody in Chicago, we all come from somewhere else. You liable to meet somebody who's from Mississippi, Georgia, Carolinas. The further north you go, you meet more and more people. The Good Times show in the show Good Times that took place in Chicago. all of those people that filled all of those projects more than likely came from plantations in the South. And so for Black people, we also have a narrative that we tell within our families that very clearly shows the links between the prison industrial complex and slavery. And I think that what's interesting that in this day and age, many dominant people find it unbelievable or unimaginable. And yet, in Black families, it's a common narrative. And it just says to me that, wow, our lives are so different, are so distant as people who go to the same schools, who are preparing to be compatriots. As children, we're not really citizens and we have very few rights. But so I would say that going to school in that period, rearing children, is in a sense preparing us for citizenship, for full citizenship. And yet, how can we ever be full citizens in a diverse nation where we are just really ignorant of each other, where we just don't know each other's experiences? And so we, of course, end up devaluing them. And you can look at my videos, just my videos alone, where I mention race, and you have the people talking about, oh, you're whining, you're crying, and all that stuff. And if they would listen to my videos, they would obviously know that um, that that kind of falls on deaf ears, because I can no longer really respond to that other than to say you're just ignorant. And I don't say that as an insult, because we're all ignorant about something, but I am shocked. And so I take this time to encourage all educators to read this book for themselves and make it relevant for their age group that they're teaching. For kindergarten teachers, through graduate school teachers, you need to know this aspect of the American story, because it's not just about Black people migrating. And slavery isn't just about Black people and our emancipation, but it's also about the will to dominate and the ability to do so. I often give the example of it's an incident in the life of a slave girl where this man is tying this woman, this Black slave, I believe she would have been called a wench or a bitch, face forward, naked, stripped her down, stripped her, beat her, whipped her, kicked her in the mouth because she's screaming in front of his children and wife at breakfast. The white master. So you ask me, how traumatizing is that for white identity to be able for that to be a common narrative? And I've never heard white people talk about that aspect of slavery. How is it dehumanizing for us to commit this? And so, for all the whining that people hear I hear white noise. A gaping, oozing sort of silence about what it is like to dehumanize the other, to try and place oneself on a pedestal when we are all just human. That is also a part of the healing process that won't happen until you start to hear more white people talk about from their perspective. And so I take this challenge, this opportunity of Isabel Wilkerson's book, to also challenge white Americans to do more oral history, to tell us what about your past forms your identity today. Because there's a lot of pretense that it doesn't. And from our side, it takes two to tango. So we weren't just whipped and beaten and maimed, but there were people, whipping, beating, and maiming other people. And these were Christians. These were all Christians. I'm here in Germany now. I went to one of the many American servicemen's cemeteries from World War II. Huge. And so there are lots of crosses and a few stars of David. And I asked the attendant, were there any Muslims? Where are the Muslims, and how would they be marked? And he said, the official was that there are only crosses and stars of David. There were no, Muslim soldiers in World War II. And we all know that can't possibly be true. Now, there may have been people who denounced Islam or only superficially declared themselves as Christians so that they may fit in. I think that one good example that we saw is Queen Noor, that we saw in Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s series on the American Story. I can't remember what it's called, but he does the DNA testing of people, and he does the first series about African Americans. They're so popular that he started doing other Americans, and he found out that Queen Noor is actually an Arab American. It didn't seem like that she knew that she had Lebanese roots. And so I'm trying to figure out if she had constructed a white identity for herself. But obviously these people were coming from the so-called Arab world. And so how many of those people's stories are cached, are hidden behind crosses? But those are the kinds of stories that other people, that we as Black people couldn't turn away from. There are periods, and I would say, for those who grew up, like my grandparents, who their grandparents were slaves, and they refused to tell them, refused to retell these stories. But I also wonder what stories white people refuse to tell. So take this as a mutual challenge for all of us Americans to try and get to know and understand each other a little bit better, so that we aren't just wacko, so that we don't just accuse each other of whining and grinding, and that we really develop an empathetic language in America. And we have to do that. We have to start by just knowing each other. So I'm excited for this book. I'm excited for many of the books now that come out to talk about this history. And I'm excited that my own experience receives some kind of validation as an American, because we are migrating back south.